Good morning. I'm Steve Steinhubel. I'm the Chief Medical Officer for physIQ. I'm a practicing cardiologist, but throughout the majority of my career, I've been dedicated a significant portion of my time to clinical research. For the last decade or so, my research is focused on the implementation of digital technologies to help transform healthcare and health research to be more participant-centric, more pragmatic, more individualized, and more cost-effective. I'm honored to be joined today by two chief medical officers of two of the most innovative healthcare therapeutic companies in the country, Dr. Luiz Belardinelli, who's the chief medical officer of InCarda, and Dr. Jan Komtebedde, who's the chief medical officer of Corvia.
Thank you for inviting me to speak at the summit. I am the Chief Medical Officer of InCarda Therapeutics. Previous appointments, 23 years of academia, 11 years at the University of Virginia, 12 years at the University of Florida. In the year 2000, I left academia to join CV Therapeutics in Palo Alto, California, at the time I started up company. In 2009, CV Therapeutics was acquired by Gilead Science, and I became the cardiovascular therapeutic area head of Gilead. In 2016, I left Gilead and joined InCarda Therapeutics as a CMO. During this time, we discovered and helped develop 3 cardiovascular products: Adenocar for paroxysmal supraventricular tachycardia, Lexiscan for pharmacological myocardial perfusion imaging, and ranolazine for angina pectoris. Thank you, Steve.
Hello, I'm Jan Komtebedde, Chief Medical Officer and Senior Vice President of Corvia Medical. I've been working in the medical device industry for the last 25 years, and I'm very pleased to participate in today's discussion.
Thank you, Jan, and thank you, Luiz. Let's begin now with Luiz, who will go over a very innovative trial around inhaled Flecainide for the conversion of atrial fibrillation, the most common arrhythmia problem in the world and a huge area of unmet need. Luiz?
Okay, thank you, Steve. The objectives of my presentation is to describe the development program for inhaled Flecainide for the acute cardioversion of intermittent episodes of atrial fibrillation, i.e. PAF, and to describe the use of a remote ECG monitoring technology to capture patients when they experience an episode of symptomatic atrial fibrillation. As you all know, AF is the most common sustained arrhythmia in clinical practice, with a worldwide prevalence of about 34 million and 60 million in the United States. The clinical classification of atrial fibrillation is based primarily on the temporal persistence of the episodes. Therefore, 3 categories: paroxysmal or intermittent AF, persistent AF, and permanent AF. Inhaled Flecainide is being developed for a group of patients with paroxysmal AF. The impact of atrial fibrillation on patients' health, quality of life, healthcare system resources, as described in this slide, is considerable. The unmet medical need, especially in the United States, is substantial because in US, emergency department-based acute cardioversion is not part of the care. The only drug approved in the United States is IV ibutylide, and this drug has limited efficacy, QT liability, and torsade de pointe. Key features of the inhaled Flecainide delivery platform in PK are shown. The inhalation solution is aerosolized using a breath-actuated inhaler that generates aerosol containing 4 micron particles of Flecainide that is delivered only upon inhalation. There's a rapid absorption via the lungs, resulting in a delivery of a bolus of Flecainide to the left atrium via the pulmonary veins. The PK curve on the right shows an early peak after the start of the inhalation, followed by a very rapid decline and therefore a reduced systemic exposure. This bioexponential profile is identical to that of Flecainide delivered via intravenously. This slide summarizes the clinical development program. Based on the results of phase 1 and phase 2 studies, we selected the dose of 120 milligrams for the phase 3 program. This dose of 120 milligrams resulted in a conversion rate of approximately 50%, which is a value similar to that of IV Flecainide and IV Vernaculant, 51%, and significantly better than those of Ibutilide and Propafenone, 40%. The median time to conversion, very fast, 4 minutes from the end of inhalation. All AEs were mild, transient, and none require any treatment. Following discussions with the FDA, we developed a phase 3 trial called RESTORE-1, which is a double-blind, placebo-controlled study in 400 patients randomized 3-to-1, Flecainide and placebo. The primary endpoint of this phase 3 study is the proportion of patients whose AF converted to sinus rhythm within 90 minutes of the start of the inhalation. In this slide, I want to focus on the patient population to be enrolled on this phase 3. 3 types of patients with AF symptoms of less than 48 hours are eligible for enrollment, and they are patients with first diagnosed AF, patients with recurrent AF, and patients that underwent ablation and had a recurrent episode. As for enrollment challenge, we need to consider the following. First, atrial fibrillation occurs randomly. Patients with paroxysmal AF may have only 3 to 4 episodes, symptomatic episodes a year. Therefore, patients need to be captured, i.e. be at the site of the study when AF is present. A solution to this challenge is to pre-screen patients with recurrent episodes and the use of a remote ECG monitoring technology to capture them when AF occurs. The pre-screen strategy is reserved to patients previously diagnosed with AF who are currently in sinus rhythm. And this strategy can be summarized in 3 words: identify the patients, engage them, and capture them when AF occurs. And this is better illustrated in the next slide. In this slide, starting from the left, first, the patient is identified, found to be eligible to receive Flecainide, consented and trained primarily on the inhalation procedure and the deployment of the remote ECG device. Then, the patient is discharged home. When at home and the patient experiences symptoms, the patient will be asked to apply a patch to record ECG. This ECG will be transmitted to the core laboratory, and from the core laboratory will inform the site and a central medical service unit that often I refer as concierge service. This concierge service then will communicate with the patient and the clinical site to the return of the patient to the clinical site to be studied. Now, let's take a look at the remote ECG monitoring system. This system comprises of a patch or a watch. The patch needs to be affixed to the patient's upper left chest when symptoms of AF occur. The ECG from the patch transmitted to the phone, and the signals from the phone are streamed to the cloud, and from the cloud to the core laboratory. physIQ uses and developed an FDA-approved AF detection algorithm with a sensitivity of 99.7% and positive predictive value of 98.6%. In summary, it is feasible to administer Flecainide via oral inhalation for conversion of AF to sinus rhythm, and when conversion occurs, is rapid, in approximately 4 minutes. Administration of Flecainide via oral inhalation is safe. All adverse events resolve spontaneously, requiring no treatment. Importantly, remote monitoring of patients previously diagnosed with PAF is key for capture them when they present with AF. Therefore, inhaled Flecainide has the potential to become a cost-effective option for rapid cardioversion in the emergency department and therefore reduce hospital admissions. Thank you.
Thank you, Luiz, for that presentation. Next up, we'll have Jan, who will go over the design of a very innovative trial of a very innovative technology that's designed to meet a huge unmet clinical need, and that's in patients with heart failure and preserved ejection fraction. Jan?
Great, thank you, Steve. For decades, physicians have been managing heart failure using diuretics to modify total blood volume in order to control cardiac pressures. Corvia Medical is a small startup focused on transforming the management of the most common type of heart failure, which currently has limited treatment options, using an implant which is placed percutaneously by a cardiologist between the two upper chambers of the heart, creating a shunt. We believe that atrial shunting could supplement current therapies by providing a novel therapeutic approach that specifically regulates cardiac pressures and volumes. The shunt approach is physiologically validated and self-regulating, meaning that as left atrial pressure rises, for example, during exercise, the amount of shunting increases, and this shifts of volume from left to right atrium lowers the left atrial pressure with the intent of improving patients' symptoms and clinical outcomes, including quality of life. This novel approach has developed substantial clinical experience, which has been published in peer-reviewed medical journals, as you can see here. And we are currently awaiting the results of a large global pivotal trial. So I'll summarize the study design shortly, but in addition to standard monitoring and follow-up, we have incorporated physIQ in our pivotal program. In our case, we're using the data retrospectively, as opposed for real-time patient management as employed by InCarda Therapeutics and other companies that, for example, use implantable monitors. While we are using physIQ in a different manner, it's important to note that both atrial fibrillation and heart failure often occur in the same patient, and one may cause or contribute to the other. The pivotal trial includes over 600 patients, which are randomized 1-to-1 to device plus medical management or medical management alone. And the purpose is to evaluate the clinical efficacy and safety of our device. For a medical device study, this is a large study conducted at over 100 sites in 17 countries on 4 different continents. What also is unique about our study that both the patient and the managing heart failure clinician and some of the hospital staff is blinded for 2 years with respect to the treatment arm of the patient. You can see on the right-hand side of the slide that we are, in addition to the primary endpoint, which includes quality of life assessment, we're also looking at symptoms and quality of life as secondary endpoints. Let's briefly talk about the primary treatment goals for heart failure patients. I think they're relatively straightforward, but it's worth discussing them. So clearly, we would like to increase quantity of life, reduce hospitalization for heart failure, and improve quality of life. Quality of life can be measured in a variety of ways. So how do we do that in a clinical trial? In a typical clinical trial, the first 2 are easy because both mortality events and heart failure events are reported as serious adverse events per the requirements. So it becomes more challenging when you want to assess quality of life. So what tools are available to assess quality of life, and how are these tools typically used in clinical studies? So let's look at how we've done this so far. In prior studies, we did demonstrate that symptoms and quality of life improved using New York Heart Class Assessment, which uses 4 classes, where class 1 indicates that the patient is asymptomatic, and class 4 when the patient is symptomatic even at rest, sitting in a chair or standing. And you can see that patients improve comparing baseline to 3 years. For quality of life, we use a tool called Minnesota Living with Heart Failure, which uses a scale of 0 to 105, with lower scores indicating better quality of life and a change of 5 points being considered clinically meaningful. So while you could theoretically assess New York heart class and quality of life daily, this is obviously too cumbersome, as this data is typically collected at the time of a hospital visit and requires the involvement of a physician. And preferably, if you collect New York heart class over time, you would like the same physician to make that assessment each time to try to minimize potential bias. So as I mentioned, conventionally assessments are made infrequently, once, at month 1, at 3 or 6 months, 12 months, and then annually. And, our FDA requires follow-up of patients for 5 years. So how can we bridge these large time gaps in data collection? So we can do that by using more frequent assessment using telemonitoring technology. And Corvia chose physIQ for the pivotal trial, specifically to supplement conventional quality of life data by looking at the patient's activity level and at orthopnea incidence. So orthopnea is an indication of how well or how poorly a patient is able to sleep flat. In addition, we were adding assessment of additional parameters that are not available using conventional methodology, which is looking specifically at the incidence of arrhythmias in our patient population. Then separately, in addition to these 3 parameters, we're obviously collecting a large amount of information in addition to these 3, and that can be used to determine a patient's physiologic status at different points in time to see how a patient deviates in a positive or a negative way from their baseline state. And that's, of course, becomes important when you try to compare 2 different patient populations. So how did we implement this program? We obviously needed to train the hospital staff who was responsible for educating the patients how to use it. We collected baseline data prior to randomization for a period of 3 to 5 days to establish a baseline physiologic state against which a patient could be compared to. Then post-randomization, we had very intense follow-up. So 3 months for about 6 days each week. Then the next 9 months, 1 week per month. So we have data collected in approximately 400 patients using, I think, about 11,500 patches. Based on feedback from physIQ, the data that we've collected is of high quality. We have close to 1 million hours of continuous vital signs and activity measurements, over 4 million heartbeats, and over 1 million breaths collected in the data set. We locked the database of the study in September, and the analyses are currently ongoing. So that's all I have for my presentation, and I look forward to the panel discussion, Steve.
Thank you, Jan, and thank you, Luiz, for your earlier presentation. Now we have the opportunity to really dive into some of the details and a panel discussion. And unfortunately, because this isn't live, you in the audience don't have a chance to ask questions of us live. But however, we highly encourage you that if you do have any questions, please email us at the email address shown on the screen here, info@physiq.com. And whether it's a question for me, for Jan, or for Luiz, we'll make sure that the questions get forwarded to the right people. Jan, after your great presentation, I want to start with you with the question. Your trial design not only is addressing, well, in general, your therapeutic is addressing a huge unmet need, but your trial design was really innovative, which historically in both healthcare and healthcare research, innovation hasn't necessarily been met with wide open arms and enthusiasm. There's always challenges to doing anything different. I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit about what you experienced and what your team experienced, both with the study sites, but also particularly with the participants in the study, what they felt about the incorporation of wearables, what was the good, and what, on the outside chance there was some bad, what was the bad?
Yeah, thank you, Steve. I think it's a very important question. let me make a few comments. I think, first of all, for our organization, this was novel. So we had conducted, several studies before we started the pivotal trial, and we had not included any type of telemonitoring devices or technologies in our study. So, but in thinking about the pivotal trial and thinking about the importance of quality of life, I pushed the company to consider this. And, obviously at the time, there were a few types of technologies available. I think some were definitely more inconvenient for the patients to use than others. And that's really why I thought the patch approach would be the easiest for our patient population. So that was one thing. In thinking about the patient population, patients above the age of 40, up to an age of maybe 94, living in urban and suburban and remote areas with varied access to the cloud, if you will. So, we did anticipate some challenges, but it also, did create opportunities because, a patient that lives 300 miles away doesn't want to come in every week or every month for a follow-up exam. So that's one of the big advantages of using telemonitoring devices. With respect to the sites, I think there were definitely a few sites who said, why do we have to do this? Why can't we just do it the old way? Which, we'll see the patient once in a while and we collect the data then. But I think there was very little pushback from the site staff. And I'm not talking about the investigators themselves, because they really had very little exposure to the technology. It's really the site staff. So I think physIQ did a great job to prepare the site staff on how to use the technology and also how to explain it to the patients. So we as Corvia were not directly involved in the patient education. And as you can imagine, with the types of patients that we are enrolling in our trial, there definitely were from time to time challenges in, patients' understanding of how to use this, when to change the patch and to remember all of that, making sure that their hardware was charged at all times. But in general, most patients actually liked it because it gave them an idea of, being monitored, being kept an eye on, which I think, patients do appreciate, even though, we did explain to the patient that we would not use the data in real time to determine how they were going to be managed. So I think some of the main challenges that we encountered were related to a few patients who had skin irritation from the patch. And I think that was related to an adhesive that was used in the original patch, which was, that issue went away when the next series of patch was being used. Some patients just could not remember to keep their devices charged. And then I think the only other challenge was related to the remote location of some patients where the internet access was a challenge. And I think from a hospital perspective, there were a few issues with firewalls that we had to deal with. But all in all, I think this was well received by both the hospitals and the patients that participated in our study.
That was great. And I'm glad you called out the ability to enroll individuals who live remotely, because I think that hasn't been well appreciated, that basically until recently, that one of the major criteria for being able to participate in a clinical trial is living in proximity to a research center. So by using these connected devices and wearables, that it opens up enrollment to a much larger population, and which hopefully will translate into better real world implementation. The issues you found with connectivity, which hopefully is becoming less and less for using our technology, you just need access to a cellular signal, which we hope in the US is is pretty widespread, but there are areas in remote areas where that's still not the case. And I think as the challenges of the patch and the adhesive aspects of that is always that there's the watch as or other wearables, and then the trade-off of the watch where you really get high quality data of just a fraction of the day, especially the day when somebody's awake, a little bit better, 20 to 30% good quality data in the evenings when somebody's sleeping. So while there's great things with wearables, and the whole field is getting better and better. And so since one of physIQ's major focuses on being device agnostic, that as the technologies get better, that we're able to incorporate those and make the experience even better with each patient experience. So, Luis, let me follow up with you and the work you're doing, which is so exciting. First, go through, so as I mentioned, I'm a cardiologist, but I did mention I practice in Alaska, which is a unique area, but it's actually not that unique in many ways. But what makes it unique is we have a lot of patients who live very remote, who aren't connected by road to areas where they can drive to a hospital. And so it ends up being a very expensive air ambulance flight for somebody who goes into AFib in a remote area and has to come into the emergency room. So go over a little bit about what is the current standard of care and how your therapeutic can help change that.
Okay, thank you, Steve. Great question. I'm going to address in two steps. First, what is the current standard of care? And I'm going to focus primarily in the United States. And then I'm going to tell you about our own plans, because the final destination for this product that we're trying to develop is to be used at home for the exact reasons you put forward, to decrease the need of patient to go to an emergency room, because that's where the major cost is. As you know, major cost is patients showing up in the emergency department, close to 60% end up being admitted to the hospital. And that's why the healthcare burden for this disease is extraordinarily high. So current care in the United States, there's at least 3 approaches. One is simply rate control. I don't bother in restoring sinus rhythm, only give either a beta blocker or a calcium channel blocker. This is the preferred approach in the United States. That is put along with a strategy that's called wait and watch, or wait and see. You give a rate control drug and you hope that within 24, 48 hours, this patient will convert spontaneously to normal sinus rhythm. And the third approach is what they call rhythm control, where when the AF is detected, you're going to try to restore sinus rhythm. And there's 2 ways to do that. One, electrically, and the other one, pharmacologically. We prefer pharmacological. That's what our products are. Electrical, as you know, is very effective, but require the patient to be fasting, require the patient to be anesthetized. Okay, so this add another dimension, is resource intensive. Electrocardioversion is resource intensive. In the United States, as I mentioned, there's only one drug, Steve, approved for acute cardioversion. It's called Ibutylide. The utilization of Ibutylide is absolutely minimal. It's in single digits, like 9–10%, because physicians are afraid of bad outcomes, cause torsado point. Put the patient in a polymorphic VT, far worse than being in AF. We don't like the wait and see, because that's an opportunity where in the ER in the United States, very commonly, the ER physician give a rate control drug, a beta blocker, a calcium channel blocker, and call upstairs, call the cardiologist for a consult, and the cardiology admit the patient to the hospital. So next day, they can cardiovert the patient. We're trying to do this by providing this inhaled Flecainide to be used in the ED department first. So first, we want to seek approval for the medically supervised, could be in the hospital, could be in urgent care, could be in your office as a cardiologist, could be in a cardiology group practice. As we show that it's safe in selected patients, that the drug is effective, and he doesn't have any major adverse events, this patient can be trained to do this at home. But when he's at home, the selected patients will be able to record remotely vital signs and electrocardiogram, such as using your physIQ, because as you know, with the physIQ, when you affix the patch to the chest and you start recording within 20, 30 minutes, the core lab can see already the ECG and confirm that those symptoms are indeed AF, and therefore the patient should be eligible then to inhale the Flecainide, which you can do via camera, like we're doing now, via telemedicine. So that's the final destination of this product. And I can see even in the future, when we have this drug approved, that your technology, what we're trying to do to pre-screen the patients, select the patients in advance, physIQ can be used to monitor the cardioversion at home.
I think that's great. And I think it's underappreciated. And again, maybe it's because, like I said, Alaska is not that different, but maybe it's compounded the things we see. But we often have patients who have known paroxysmal atrial fibrillation, go into atrial fibrillation, and by the time they get to Anchorage, they have tachycardia-induced cardiomyopathy. So not only do they have atrial fibrillation with rapid response that remotely they've been able to control, but now they also have heart failure on top of that. In addition, it's, when you think about what we have now for home monitoring of ECGs, that 5 years ago we had, the idea of home monitoring for ECG would have been, science fiction. But now, with both smartwatches and consumer-friendly patches and other just smartphone-based devices, we're getting better and better, and we keep getting better and better at being able to identify atrial fibrillation maybe before there's even symptoms, or ideally before there's any symptoms, to alert somebody and then allow them to treat themselves at home. I think that would be a huge benefit.
Yeah, I see a time where, cardioversion outside the hospital will be possible when you combine products like the ones we're trying to develop, combined with this wearable, with telemonitoring. This is very possible and safer. And think about this, hospital admissions with primary reason AF, close to 1 million patients a year.
Wow.
That's extraordinarily high. And it doesn't count the number of patients, Steve, that don't go to the emergency room because they know if they go to the emergency room, very little going to happen to them. All they're going to be done is giving a beta blocker or a calcium channel to slow the rate, okay? And they're going to just wait and watch for all the cardiologists to be admitted or send it home to find out if next day you converted spontaneously back to sinus rhythm. Our conversion rate being 4 minutes is extraordinarily fast. You get the answer very quickly. You know whether you're good to go. Shortens the length of stay in the hospital.
Yeah. Well, and I think your vision is of the idea of being diagnosed and treatment at home, not only for atrial fibrillation, but I think goes for many things. And it's the capabilities of what wearables mixed with therapeutics built as very participant-centric or patient-centric is going to be the future of healthcare. So I think it's great. We just have a minute or two. I want to end by asking both of you a question that both clinically is tough for me, and for both of your clinical trials is a challenge. We have very limited measures of functional capacity and quality of life. So when I see a patient in clinic, I try to, if I've seen them before, I'll say, okay, how do you feel when you walk to your mailbox? Because last time they told me they get shorter breath when they walk to their mailbox. And so I have this very subjective measure that maybe I find out once every 3 months or however often I see patients. In clinical trials, both of your therapeutic interventions are designed to improve people's functional capacity, to improve their quality of life. And then we have tests like 6-minute walk tests and KCCQ surveys. There's AFib specific quality of life, which are okay, but and on a population, they're fine, but on an individual limited. So where do you see the future of being objective measures of functional capacity? Do you see that being a value in both for your companies, but even for the whole field?
So I think I see tremendous value because one of the flaws of the conventional approach is very intermittent assessment of the quality of life parameters, and they're related to symptoms, how patients feel, You may catch the patient when they have a cold, when they complete their KCCQ questionnaire, or when they do their 6-minute walk test, and that may or may not be detected. So I think this very frequent assessment using wearables will tell us a whole lot more about patients' quality of life than we are able to do by any other means. So I see a lot of value. One of the questions is, how do you intervene? And I wanted to briefly follow up on the point that Luiz made earlier. In heart failure, we see the same as we see with AFib. So patients go to the hospital for a heart failure event, but weeks prior to that, there are already changes in their physiology that could advise whoever monitors them that something needs to be changed. And that one change could be increasing their diuretic dose, so they don't have to go to the hospital 2 weeks later for a much more invasive and expensive intervention. So I see a lot of, obviously we don't know the data from our trial yet, but I'm hoping that something in the patient's physiology will be able to predict an event, an emerging event before it actually happens. So I think that's the future.
From our side, from the disease we're trying to tackle in our product, in terms of patients' quality of life, is very obvious. If I can prevent or avoid a visit to the emergency room, this is a big deal for the patient quality of life.
Yeah.
It's a big deal for the cost for the healthcare, right? And even if you have to go and I can discharge you within hours, 2 hours. Remember, the time life in the emergency room is measuring 4-hour periods. Okay. In our study, this was post hoc analysis done in the Netherlands. Patients that cardioverted, they were discharged within 2 hours. Patients that did not convert it, they were discharged more than 4 hours later. So that makes a big difference in terms of cost for these individuals. And obviously, the requirement of additional medications and the uncertainty if you don't convert, are you going to convert spontaneously or not? So, as you said, I think the quality of life, the patients, and as you mentioned too, AF, we only think about in terms of relief of symptoms, but as you're right, heart function get compromised.
Yeah.
Cardiac output goes down. Patients have fatigue, chest discomfort. They get very anxious. Patients that have AF, the first time they are scared. They think there's something is bad happening to their heart, that they can die. Obviously, if you have repeated episodes, they learn that this is AF and this is not necessarily life-threatening, but nevertheless, produce a high level of anxiety and discomfort.
One example in one of our prior studies. So the first patient that was implanted with a Corvia device had been sleeping in a chair for several years because she could not lay flat. Within a week of the implants, he was able to lay in a bed with just one pillow. And as you know, with physIQ, you can measure orthopnea, so the patient's ability to sleep comfortably in a flat position or not. So I think that's one of the other values that will come out of the trial.
That's great for bringing it. Thank you. I agree. All right. Well, thank you again, Jan, Luiz. This has been a great session. It would have been so much better if we could have all done it in person and been in Boston, but maybe next year. And thank you for the audience for listening. And remember, if there are any questions that you'd like to follow up with in the email at info@physiq.com, just send us your questions. Thank you, everybody, and enjoy the rest of the meeting.